Good evening. My name's Tom Giroux. I'm the Vice President of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, but I like to call myself the Zoom guy. I help with Don Schnitzler, who is online tonight, and will be moderating this session. But before we do that, I wanted to give you a little information about the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. You can see our mission there: to inform, educate, archive, and publish. So that's what we're all about. If you're so inclined to join us, a membership is appreciated. All our webinars, however, are free. You don't have to pay for them, whether you're a member or not. It's part of our educate and inform part of our mission. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don Schnitzler, who is going to introduce our speaker and topic for the evening.
Okay. Before I introduce Ryan tonight, a couple housekeeping issues. First off, I want to thank everyone who participated in the webinar last week when it didn't work, and thank you for coming back tonight. I also want to welcome everyone that wasn't online last week that signed up this week for this webinar. Just as we thought last week, it's going to be a really good talk, and we're all looking forward to it. A couple of housekeeping issues before we start tonight. During the webinar, if you have questions that come up, please use the chat feature and type those questions into the chat. Tom and I will keep an eye on the chat box and try to answer any questions that aren't concerning the talk as we go through. So if you're having a problem with something, can't hear, put it in chat. We'll see what we can do to fix it. If there's a question about something Ryan has said during the presentation, we'll save all of those for the end of the talk and ask Ryan the questions at the end of the presentation. Next month, we're going to have another webinar, and that one will be by John Berg, and he will be talking about lumber or the blacksmiths in logging camps. And so we can get some information out to you about that. Tonight's webinar is, though, about the past in the pines, the archaeology of historic logging in Wisconsin. And this talk is going to discuss how archaeologists currently address the periods and the varieties of historical logging sites. And Ryan is going to take us back and talk to us about all the various things connected with that. Ryan has been conducting archaeological studies for more than 25 years. He's currently the garrison archaeologist at Fort McCoy for the Fort McCoy Army Base near Sparta. He's worked in private industry. He's worked with the government, and he's worked with various archaeological societies and research centers. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Ryan and let him tell us about the historic logging that he can uncover doing archaeological research. Ryan.
Thank you, Don and Tom. I'll share screen here. So yeah, as Don and Tom were saying, my talk is about the historic archaeology of logging in Wisconsin. Now you might think, well, archaeology of logging, the logging still going on right now. Why are we doing archaeological digs of something that's still going on now? And, logging history in Wisconsin goes back pretty far to the early 1800s, but most of it occurred in the 1850s and 1870s. And you might say, well, of all the fabulous ruins and ancient sites in the world, why are you interested in looking at logging sites as an archaeologist? And there's a couple of reasons. One is archaeology today is very driven by environmental regulations. And so a lot of archaeology gets done basically because it's where it's at in the middle of in the front of a highway or a power line or something like that. And that's my business. I do what's called cultural resource management archaeology or contract archaeology, salvage archaeology. Essentially, I'm going out in front of a development in case of the Army, a new bombing range or something like that. In the case of a DOT, building a new highway or a new power line, and I'm looking at any history and archaeology that I encounter. And similar to that, in northern Wisconsin, you're looking at, say, the National Forest, whenever they're doing a timber sale or anything up there, they're going to encounter logging sites, because that's what we're going to discuss here. Logging sites are everywhere in northern Wisconsin. And so we've been basically forced to talk about logging sites and their history, because the environmental regulations that I work under have us treat any past object that's more than 50 years old the same as we would anything that's 10 or 15,000 years old. So a Native American campsite that's 12,000 years old gets treated the same as a CCC camp or a World War II barracks or something like that under the law. And so a lot of logging archaeology has been driven by the national forest programs, particularly people like Sean Dunham and um, Cindy Stiles and the Brewies and people up there in the Nicolet Forest and things like that that have been working in these kind of traditional logging camp areas, have driven a lot of this work over the last 30 or 40 years. Also we'll talk about a little bit about historical archaeology versus prehistorical archaeology, or pre-contact archaeology versus contact archaeology. And that has a slightly different twist to it. Also, from my perspective, archaeology comes out of anthropology in the United States. And so we're a study of peoples. And if you want to talk about lumber camps as being a study of peoples, it's a fascinating sociology there. If you look at the picture there on the talk, you've got people there who are probably from a lot of different ethnicities from all over Europe, Eastern Europe, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, things like that. There were Native American loggers, there were African American loggers, and they all were speaking different languages when they came here, and yet all had to get together and form this kind of unique society in the woods to do this economic activity of logging. And so from an anthropology and sociology perspective, logging is really fascinating that way. Kind of how do people create a society out of the blue when really they're in kind of a Tower of Babel situation before they go there. So without further ado, we'll get into it here. So again, Past in the Pines, the Archaeology of Historic Area Logging in Wisconsin. This talk is from a publication that was done in the Wisconsin Archaeologist. It's available online at the Wisconsin Archaeology Society webpage, and it was done by me, Sean Dunham, and Chuck Moffett. So if you're interested in actually getting the hard copy of this talk, it's available. And I'll share that link with Don and Tom for everybody and post it for the webpage if you want, Facebook page. So when we're talking about logging in Wisconsin, I mean, this is the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. So, most of you are well familiar with how historic logging transforms Wisconsin, especially from the kind of its peak period in the 1850s to the 1890s. And on the left there, we've got log jams in the St. Croix and Chippewa rivers with the white pine coming down in just, in tons. On the right of the slide there, you've got timber rafts coming through on the Wisconsin River. And this really impacted Wisconsin, really was kind of the formation of the Wisconsin we know today, especially kind of the up north woods Wisconsin. So if we look at Wisconsin prior to kind of the logging boom, here's 1838, for instance, on the left. Wisconsin as a state was pretty much focused mainly in the extreme southeastern part of the state as we know it now, particularly around the lead region down in the southwest. The lead boom, the lead rush that led to us being called badgers. That is based on holes dug by lead miners, badger holes. But if you look, that area down there is not the Pine Belt. That's not where a lot of the logging happened. But if you look, down in the area around Pine River in the driftless area here where my mouse is, there was actually a small pinery down there. And that's why there's a Pine River in the middle of the driftless area down by the Kickapoo. And that was one of the first pineries to get logged out of Prairie du Chien. That's a history that hasn't really been exposed yet. But you can see here in the early vegetation of Wisconsin, the dark green kind of represents the Pine Belt. The yellow is kind of more of the agricultural oaks and things like that. But you can see here that the early settlement was mainly in this yellow area. And so really until logging kicked off, there was not a draw to pull people north of the Wisconsin Fox Riverway. But after logging, here we're in 1911 and 1880, you can see that the state is very much as we recognize it today. The counties are formed, the railroads are laid out, most of the major roads and travelways are there. But the landscape has been altered drastically. You've got cut over here in Marathon and some of the other counties showing you basically kind of a moonscape that was left after the old growth forest was harvested and the white pine was gone. So how does that transition occur? What's the history of that, and what kind of archaeology does that leave behind? So, we're looking at logging archaeology here. We know a lot about the history of logging. You guys know that more than anybody, but we've got historic photographs, we've got historic documents, we've got lots of great history books, Jerry App's, when the white pine was king, great things like that. So what can archaeology, you think archaeology, arrowheads, and ancient things, what does archaeology be able to tell us about logging that we don't already know? And there's, archaeology is probably best described as history in things, history in physical objects. Probably one of the best descriptions of archaeology I've ever heard is archaeology is history found in small things left behind, and basically things that fell out of people's pockets or were thrown away or were left. We're, some people would call us the history detectives, but we're actually more like history's garbage men when it comes right down to it. We find the stuff that's been left behind. And archaeology often tells us things that people in the past either tried to keep hidden or didn't write about. If you look up here in the upper right, you'll see all these little medicine bottles. And one of the things here is basically this is the 19th century equivalent of your modern pharmaceutical prescription. A lot of logging camps were dry. They weren't allowed to have alcohol for safety reasons or for social reasons or whatever. But if you go into the archaeology, you find all these medicine bottles. And of course, the major ingredient in these medicine bottles was alcohol, sometimes cocaine and sometimes heroin and other things mixed in. This was the oxycodone of the 1900s. And it's never talked about in the logging histories or the logging, tales or things like that. But this is kind of the other side, the part that your grandma and grandpa didn't want you to know about the logging sites. The fact that these are hard men in hard working conditions, dangerous conditions, and they're getting hurt, they're working hurt. And so they're relying on painkillers. And you've got people that are hardcore alcoholics out there, and they're getting their fix the only way that's legal at the job site, by using medicine. In historical archaeology, we call this the outhouse effect. Anything prior to the plumbing era that you didn't want anyone to know about, you threw down the outhouse hole. And as a result, when archaeologists dig outhouses, and we do, it's not something we relish, but it's where all the interesting things go. If you dig an outhouse on any historical site, you'll find basically all the things your grandma and grandpa tried to hide from their neighbors. Guns, contraceptives, pornography, alcohol, drugs, anything that anyone didn't want to basically have known at the Sunday church meeting or have their neighbors know about is going to be in the outhouse. And so when archaeologists dig a site, we find everything, all the trash that people left behind. And that's the history, the written history is silent or limited about. And so archaeology can serve as a complement to that written history, kind of showing here's the written side that is kind of the story that wanted to be told. Here's what was actually happening on the ground. The other side is that archaeology is really good at complementing the written records as far as finding out what something is when there aren't enough historical records to go on. This is a mill and dam site from the 1870s by Black River, and this is all there is. It's a little jot on a map from the 1870s saying mill dam here. But if you go there as an archaeologist, I could tell you what period that was, maybe what logging camp it was, when it was being used, what kind of technology they were using there. So I can kind of fill in those pages that aren't in the history book or in the history maps or the records that we have available to us. The other thing is, written history has a bias. How many loggers were literate? How many wrote about their experiences? There's an old saying that history is written by the victors. The reality is that history is written by the wealthy and well-educated. So the history, here we have Joseph Spalding, who's kind of the founder of my little local town of Black River Falls, or a claim founder anyway, early lumber baron, early lumberman. But, his history has been well written about because he paid for it to be written about. And people that were writing history wanted him to be pleased with the history they wrote. Ole and Schvinn down here cutting logs for Mr. Spalding don't have quite as much history written about them. So there are people that get kind of whitewashed out of the history, the traditional histories that came out of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, kind of the more traditional histories. Where are the women? We're told that logging camps were usually male only, but you look at the photos and there's a lot of women there. Where are they? What's their story? minorities. Again, you look at the photos, you look at the names, there are minorities in these camps, but you don't see much reference to them. Native Americans, same thing. We know that they were active in the lumber industry. Don't see much about their stories in these kind of traditional histories. So archaeology serves again to kind of show that other side of the circle. If you've got that written historical records on top, archaeology is on the bottom showing the other parts of it. So if we're looking at archaeological sites in Wisconsin, we've got quite a few. There's probably somewhere between 15 and 2,000 logging or timber industry related sites going back. That can be anything from small little tent camps from timber cruiser camps to logging railroads, dams, spillways, towns, mills. Again, mostly known from studies done in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest or on federal lands because of the Natural Historic Preservation Act. But I mean, things like a log tramway is a logging archaeological site. Same with a mill or a big railroad terminal. That's an archaeological site. So if we're looking at early logging, I'm going to move some things here. I've got a little blockage in the viewing of my own slides. Early logging, prior to the 1850s, you had some local attempts, mainly at the Black River Pinery out of Prairie du Chien. Some of the Indian agents down there, some of the early kind of money men of the fur trade tried to get into the lumber industry. It couldn't be maintained and it couldn't be supplied in winter, and they were trying to do them without, getting basically a license from the Ho-Chunk, whose land that was at that time. And so the Ho-Chunk burned them every winter. As soon as the loggers left after cutting, they would burn the mills and would basically have them start over at zero. Had a few local mills with the lead industry down by Galena in the Apple River area, but they could really only supply local needs. There was so little timber in Wisconsin in the 1830s that when the first territorial capital was built, they had to ship lumber by ox cart out of Pennsylvania to the Ohio River and then get to Galena and then get it to Belmont. So here you are at one of the biggest pineries and lumber areas in Wisconsin, and they're shipping in timber from Pennsylvania on wagons to build the first capital. Lumber was very expensive in the 1830s. The prices in Illinois and in Iowa were around $100 then at 1,000 board feet. Now, a working man at that time would have made about $10 to $20 a month. So that gives you some idea. You're talking about $5,000 to $10,000 for 1,000 board feet, probably about 700% of the current adjusted value of lumber, even with today's high lumber prices. So basically, pine was as good as gold in the 1830s in Wisconsin. And so much so that houses were routinely shipped disassembled from Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana to Wisconsin to be built. They were literally picking up the entire house, breaking it down and shipping it by wagon and steamer here versus trying to build a new house here because it was cost prohibitive. And by the 1840s, most of the middle Mississippi River forests are gone. So the forests in Illinois, Missouri, kind of the American bottom country, those forests are gone by the 1840s just to supply local needs. And so that kind of brings us into our first real attempt at logging here. And that was the Mormon, the Latter-day Saints logging community, Black River in the Neillsville area. And I think Mary Irving Gigitis is going to talk about that for you guys here in an upcoming talk. So I'll leave that to her. But essentially, to build the first Mormon temple, the LDS temple at Nauvoo, Illinois, they dispatched a logging colony to the Black River area. They had 4 mills and 6 lumber camps, and they had a settlement of about 150 to 300 people at any given time. And they cut down and milled 1.5 million board feet of timber to build the first LDS settlement at Nauvoo. And so that was kind of the real kind of, and they actually got a license from the Ho-Chunk to do it, so the Ho-Chunk didn't burn their mill down. It's amazing no one else thought of that before that. All right, let's see here. Oh, lost my slides. So what do early logging camps look like? Very early logging camps pre-1850s these are basically logging camps being set up by people coming out of Maine and the Northeast. There's always a transition period when logging moves from one kind of timber area to another. First, it was the Northeast and kind of the area in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine. Then those folks moved into the upper Midwest Pine Belt. And then when our timber was extinguished, they moved out to the Pacific Northwest, where timbering's still going on today. So you had basically people coming from Maine or hiring Maine loggers to come out and cut Wisconsin timber. And so they were using the technology of the day. They were using a thing called a muley saw, which is basically a hand saw on a reciprocating belt-driven sawmill. Single camps, usually very small, 15 to 20 people, in what was called kind of caboose or state of Maine camps, where basically you had a log cabin with a big open, basically moonroof, sunroof kind of thing for the fire, and a big central pit, something you might have seen in a Viking longhouse back in the day. Roofs are shingled and covered with hollowed logs, but this is a style that was common in the Northeast, but it really wasn't designed for a Wisconsin winter. And then we get into the really what we think of as the kind of the classic logging, the pinery logging of the 1850s to 1900s. And this is, you're talking about the white pine, going after the white pine that can be floated down the river. And we're talking about large, kind of corporate / big communities of 100, 200, 300 loggers in various camps, maybe a company having multiple logging camps going at any given time, and cutting down some pretty good sized trees. This is old growth white pine. That's not redwood. That's old growth white pine in northern Wisconsin at the time. So we look at what's the classic archaeological site for a period from the Pinery kind of period. You're looking at what's called a Dingle camp, which is basically a bunkhouse and a cookhouse. If you think about, you've got a bunkhouse and a cookhouse, and then you've got kind of this covered area in between that serves as kind of a porch and a general activity area. But the idea being that you can sleep on one side, you can cook on another, and you can do activities in between with a minimal amount of construction. You can build these using, basically local tools and the local lumber that's there. And they're built, and then they're, as soon as they're done, they're abandoned, and you build another one at your next spot. They would have outbuildings. You'd have blacksmiths, like you're going to hear about coming up, stables, things like that for the oxen and the horses, saw filer sheds, things like that. So they'd have outbuildings around them, but your main focus of each logging camp would be this kind of Dingle, a bunkhouse and cookhouse combination. Usually they ran 30 to 50 men at each camp, but like I said, you could easily have 5 or 6 camps within 5 or 10 miles of each other, as we'll talk about when we get to the logging landscape. So again, we're looking at kind of, here's an example of a archaeology site from one of these Dingle camps up in the Nicolet. And you can see there's berming around the actual outside of the buildings, the entrance of the buildings. You've got probably a cook stove there, the bunkhouse, and probably the cookhouse here. And what they're doing is they're berming up earth around these for insulation in the wintertime, because logging's a winter activity in Wisconsin. So what does that leave archaeologically? Well, that's what it looks like. You've got basically a earthen berm that's left over. The logs have rotted away or burned away, or they're long gone, but the berm of dirt is still there. And so if you look at it from an aerial photo where you come up, you can see the raise in the ground of the berm around where the old bunkhouse used to be. And the archaeology then is both inside there in the living area, but would mainly be back here in the throwaway kind of garbage dump that would have been associated with it, and the outhouses and things like that. So we look at a late pinery camp. This is, you're getting basically, logging and timber camps get more complex, bigger, more well-financed, more capital, more people. That's a trend you get in any industry, but it happens in logging as well. You'll get into, again, that's still that kind of that Dingle idea, but now you're getting into a much larger kind of prefab structure. You've got chimneys, you've got windows that have been brought in, the outbuildings. You've got tar paper shacks here with, again, windows being brought in. Much larger, more complex sites, kind of growing out of that original Dingle camp, more people. But at the same time that you have kind of corporate logging going on, you also have small crews and jobbers who are basically, family operations, small companies, small local logging outfits, in southern Wisconsin, that are still doing kind of that initial kind of stage of logging. And again, you've got women and children here, things you don't hear about in the lumberjack lore, kind of speak. And these are the foundational sites for a lot of southern Wisconsin. The first thing people needed in southern Wisconsin was a flour mill and a timber mill, because you had to be able to process your grain that you grew. And you had to have timber to build your farms. And it was small crews and jobbers and things like that that provided that throughout Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, as well as southern Wisconsin. But that's something that's not kind of the classic lumberjack thought, but it drove a lot of the actual on the ground history of Wisconsin. And again, Native Americans in logging. Native Americans were particularly well known for log drivers, people who ran the log floats or the log jams on the rivers. They were particularly prized for that skill. But they were involved in all aspects of the logging industry. The Menominee are a classic example. I mean, people who developed essentially a sustainable forestry by bringing in their traditional understanding of nature and bringing in the lumber industry, and being one of the most successful logging operations in history, so much so that European scientists would come and study the Menominee forest to see how they could rebuild their timber stands and have sustainable forestry. And a lot of the processes you see in modern forestry today come out of Native American ideas of how to log. So again, what does an archaeological site look like when you're talking about logging? It's not going to look like much, and you'd miss it if you don't know what to look for. This is an outhouse. You're finding basically a small cavity there, bermed up around again for insulation. You're looking at borrow ditches here for some of the berms. You're going to find bottles and cans everywhere, because glass and things like that don't break down naturally. But in an overgrown patch of the North Woods, it's not going to look like, a ruin or even a halfway decent house foundation. It's going to be lumps and bumps in the ground and occasional artifacts. But what's generating those artifacts? If you think about the material culture, that's what archaeologists would call the artifacts, things that are being used by people. Logging camps had a lot of people and a lot of stuff. Every plate, every glass, every mug, every nail that's in these buildings, stoves, barrel loops, things like that, all of that are potential artifacts. It's just a matter of what got broken, what got lost, and what got thrown away. And that's what we're going to find. The things that got taken with them when they left, we're not going to find. And that's the difference between the historical photos and the discussions. No one ever talks about, say, the tin enamelware used by loggers in Marinette County. Archaeologists can tell you what the tin enamelware used by loggers in Marinette County was, with probably painful accuracy. So there's that detail that archaeology brings to the equation. Again, you're going to learn about, kind of the outbuildings here, blacksmiths and saw filers. Those folks have specialty buildings, and you can pick up on those specialty signatures in the archaeology. The metal dust from saw filing, the smith charred and slag from a blacksmith thing show up well. And you can easily identify those buildings by the artifacts and the debris that's left from what they're being used for. And then, of course, there's logging tools. They're a rarer find, but broken logging tools get thrown away like broken tools everywhere. So you're going to have logging chains, you're going to have PVs, you're going to have axes, all the cast iron and iron hardware of 19th century logging is going to be found on an archaeological site. They took some of that away, but if it was broken and it wasn't worth hauling back to town or taking back to the main logging corporate headquarters at the end of the winter cut, it just got pitched in the garbage. The people at that time did not have an idea about recycling. There was so much land and so much area that the idea that someday their garbage would become of interest to somebody else would never have occurred to them. So but that is what archaeology is. It's essentially the study of the garbage of these sites. And then you have some specialty artifacts. You have log brands or log stamps. These are what archaeologists call diagnostics. Basically, they allow us to, if we find a log stamp, we can tell you exactly what company it was and probably what time it was being used. And so one artifact like that can seal the deal on, okay, what was the site, what company was it, and when was it in operation? But of course, these are also valuable things to the company, and so they don't usually get thrown away unless they're broken or lost, or somebody buries them for a site and then doesn't come back for them or something like that. But they are one of those kind of, woo boy, if we get one of these, that's great kind of finds at a logging archaeology camp. Another one is lumber company tokens. You're talking about company towns a lot of times, and sometimes they didn't pay in cash. They paid in script or tokens for use at the company store. You loaded 15 tons of coal, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt, that old thing. You're basically, the company's taking your pay on the out and on the in, because you have to buy your groceries and your clothes and everything for your family from the company that's employing you at their prices and at their amount. So you do find those. And again, diagnostics, we can tell exactly what company we're looking at and exactly when it was being in use if we get lucky enough to find one of these. Of course, losing $1 is like losing a day's pay. So people would tend to go for, would work hard to find their missing dollar, unless, guess where it fell? The outhouse. If things go into the outhouse, even if they're a day's pay, you don't go in and dig them out. You want to talk about where is buried gold found in an archaeological site? It's found at the bottom of a pile of outhouse. And then not only archaeological sites and things like that, but all the associated things that go with logging, roads, tracks, railroads, sledways, things like that. Those all leave trails behind. Nails, bits of narrow gauge railroad, sled parts, things like that, and the impressions in the ground of all these old trails and roadways that the people cut are still out there and can still be picked up kind of as archaeological sites themselves. And so what you get into is kind of a landscape of history that archaeology is showing you. And again, that's a part of the landscape that you can pick up on from the historical photos, but how that all worked and the system involved and how it all worked together, sometimes archaeology can be a way to learn more about that. So we're talking about that landscape. So here's the Chippewa River, and here's the number of logging camps along one small section of it. I think this is a few miles of the Chippewa River. And basically what you got is you've got each camp was surrounded by kind of a halo of about 1 to 1.5 miles of harvest. And that was kind of considered to be the acceptable level of walk out to the camp, to the cutting, and walk back, and hauling logs that way, because past a certain point, you're spending so much time on the back and forth, both of the people and the logs, that you're losing money and productivity. And then also, you never wanted to be more than about 4 miles away from the river at any given time. So the logging corridors, the first big cuts, the early cuts were along the rivers. And then the rivers themselves were modified to be used as tools in the logging industry. You've got jam booms here. This is around Chippewa Falls. You've got a log pond that's been built. There are slipways and pilings and dividers leading down to the sawmill. So essentially, the 10 miles above Chippewa Falls on the river was essentially a factory built on the river itself, and so that's an archaeological site. So things like that if you kind of go out from the micro scale of that medicine bottle underneath somebody's cot in the bunkhouse to the entire landscape around Chippewa Falls being an archaeological site involved with logging, and everything in between. So then we get into the last period here, railroad logging. And now, instead of bringing the pine and the logs to the river to use, you're pushing the railroad right into the logs. And this is where you start getting into basically clear cutting, where essentially you can cut everything and anything anywhere across northern Wisconsin, because you can build a railroad right up to it, cut everything down, and you can bring your town right on the back of your railroad, literally sometimes your house on the back of the railroad, to these areas. And then you can work them as much as you want. And then when you're done, you just roll up the track and move on to another and lay down the track again. And this is what really led to kind of that clear cut kind of moonscape effect of the cutover of northern Wisconsin. It was this railroad logging after about 1870. And so again, systems and landscapes, here's a railroad logging camp. You've driven in a a railroad grade in here, and you basically brought out, sleeping camps, horse stables, roundhouses to maintain the railroad, a giant manure pile, you've got a much more complex, basically mini lumber town here that you brought in on the railhead, built, and now when you're done, you'll either abandon this or you'll move it out again on the back of your rail. And if you look at how this breaks down, this is one logging stand around Shell Lake in Wisconsin. You can see these are all the various narrow gauges and rails and trails that are built. The main line here that was driven in, and then essentially that company worked in this area for about 5 or 10 years until they clear cut every log here. But moving their logging camp operation around this landscape and moving their railroads around this landscape, and then shipping their logs out down through their main railroad line. And again, so you've got these little company towns, and some of these towns went on to become the towns that are in northern Wisconsin today. And a lot of the smaller towns that in Wisconsin have their background in this kind of company town, and but a lot of them were abandoned, and they became what Randall Roy calls the ghosts of the forest. These vanished lumber towns of Wisconsin, where you basically got these boom towns, very much like, kind of the boom towns of the Old West with the mines or the gold mines. But the mining here was the logging. And they were in operation for 5, 10, 20, 15 years. And then as soon as the loggers left and the money left from the logging companies, the jobs left, and then the people left, and then the buildings were all that were left. And then after, another now 120 years or 130 years, there's not much left at all of these things. They've become archaeological ruins. But a lot of them became, the towns that we know of in northern Wisconsin, Spooner and places like that. And then, of course, just because logging left didn't mean that northern Wisconsin was abandoned. The Ojibwe were still plenty. Oh, jumped ahead. The Ojibwe were there, and homesteaders moved in. This is the cutover farming of northern Wisconsin. This is a Dingle camp, being repurposed as a homestead in northern Wisconsin. But farming this landscape using horse drill plow in the late 1800s was a chore. This isn't the greatest soil anyway, and getting rid of all these stumps is a nightmare for a farmer. So much so that the basically the U.S. government provided dynamite on demand, trying to get people to farm this area. And you could basically get all the dynamite you wanted for $5 an acre up into the 1900s in northern Wisconsin, trying to clear these stump fields. And one of my colleagues, Brian Allen, is doing an archaeological study on what they call a stump farm, basically someone who's trying to come in and do a kind of a homestead farm up here on this very cheap land, but very marginal land, and trying to make a go of it as a farmer. So there's a whole archaeology post, logging and lumber up in northern Wisconsin as well. And that really hasn't seen as much work as even as logging has, which hasn't seen a lot of work. So, and then some of the things I'm interested in doing right now down at Fort McCoy, and this is real new work, is the New Deal in the forest. When you're talking about the CCC, again, 1930s, you wouldn't really think of this as ancient history, but it's older than 50 years. And so when archaeologists encounter it on federal land, we need to deal with it. The CCC, the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, these were government programs of the New Deal, kind of make work programs. But one of the deals is they could not compete with private industry. You didn't want to take away private industry jobs. So they had to do things that produced work for the kids and the young men that were part of it, but didn't produce valuable commodities or something that you could buy or sell. So, of course, one of the great things that they could do was not necessarily logging, but they could work in the forests of northern Wisconsin. Of 182 CCC camps that were founded in the 43 counties of Wisconsin, 109 of them were associated with the U.S. Forest Service and the state forests in northern Wisconsin. You can see them here. And their main interest was reforesting, going into these cutover areas and replanting the forest of the Northwoods of Wisconsin. And their efforts are what you see in the logging of the areas today. Some of the earliest red pine plantations and pine plantations were planted by the CCC in the 1930s. Fire lane cutting, all the parks and forest infrastructure up there. A lot of the road work was done. You can see they were so focused on forestry and logging and replanting that it was actually a cartoon for them. G's trees and I did not know they would be the tree suckled by the CCC kind of thing, but essentially they spent so much time doing logging or timber related work and timber rehab, forest rehab, that that was probably the main focus of the CCC in Wisconsin. And then even more extreme is POW logging. Wisconsin had a large population of World War II prisoners of war, Japanese, Germans, Italians, things like that were held in Wisconsin between 1943 and 1945. At Fort McCoy, we have this because Fort McCoy was at that time, Camp McCoy was one of the largest POW camps in the country. And we had 10 to 15,000 prisoners of war there, mainly the officers and the NCOs, the sergeants and the corporals. But there were also these regional camps that were set up across Wisconsin, mainly southern Wisconsin. And they were basically using the Germans. You had a lot of Germans in Wisconsin. And so a lot of these farmers spoke German anyway. And there was this program to kind of like use the German POWs in agriculture and in the canning factories and things like that to supplement the economy in war, because you had so many people left for the war as soldiers. One of the questions is, how much did those folks get involved in logging? We don't know very much, but if you look at photos, there's an awful lot of pictures of German POWs carrying logging tools around in some of this stuff. One of the best books on this is Stalag, Wisconsin, by Betty Cowley out of Eau Claire. But it seems like there was a program, kind of a Rent-A-German program in World War II in Wisconsin, where you could get basically anything from 1 to 2 Germans to a whole battalion if you wanted them, and they would come out there complete with guards and everything like that, and do whatever you wanted them to do, and would help out with the local economy. And they got paid by the federal government basically through the Geneva Convention as prisoners of war. And if they didn't want to work, they could sit at Fort McCoy behind the wire. But most of them wanted to get out and earn a little extra money and again, fraternize with the nice German ladies at some of these farms. So it's something that I'm looking into right now. But there does seem to be some evidence that you had, World War II Germans doing logging in Wisconsin. I think we're coming to the end there. Yep, the end. So again, the wrapping up, the idea here that, archaeology is part of that history. It tells us that other side of the story. It tells us the story of kind of Sven and Ole and all the little guys, the little, people that never made the history books, the kids, the women, the Native Americans, the folks that, never kind of make it into the mainstream histories of early Wisconsin logging, but who were critical to the history of the state and to the development of the logging industry in Wisconsin. What's this guy's story? Archaeology can help tell it. And I think with that, I'll wrap up and we'll do questions.
All right, thank you. Very interesting. Nice presentation. Thank you very much. And we do, not surprisingly, have a few questions. Madeline Cole is wondering, she's thanking you for recognizing there were women in the camps, and also it appeared to be some non-white people in the logging history. Can you speak to the lives of any of the children in the logging camps?
Well, I mean, we do find toys, we find doll pieces, things like that. Generally, what it seems to be is that like the upper crust, the foreman, the people that, the blacksmith, people that had specialized skills, who were really in demand, could bring their families in most times. But again, it was kind of frowned upon. You had all these single men in a kind of a 19th century context. The idea of this was supposed to be kind of a bachelor world, but the physical archaeology evidence suggests otherwise. They suggest that women and children are on the ground and at most of these sites.
On the race issue again, the traces of Blacks or full-blooded Native Americans working in the Wisconsin or UP camps, other than tribal, were there traces of those in the 19th century?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, you have, if you look at some of the logging rosters and things like that, you have sometimes references to race. You'll have a little B or, colored or something like that behind somebody's name. Or even in the archaeology, one thing we find in Native American camps is they're not going after canned salt pork. They're using venison. And so sometimes you can distinguish what ethnic group you're looking at by their food choices.
Sharif Fowler's wondering about digging and excavating on private property to find logging artifacts. We predicted you'd get this question. So.
Yep. This is an interesting one because on the one hand, there are some archaeologists who would say, this is looting. You're looting the history of Wisconsin. Ah! On the other hand, there are 20,000 of these sites out there. And there are about 20 archaeologists working in Wisconsin at any given time, of which probably 3 are interested in logging sites. So we're not going to get to them. What I would say is team up with a local archaeologist, team up with somebody who knows the skills and kind of can help you do it the right way. Do it as a history project. Don't do it as like just putting interesting, neat things on your shelf. They just become curios. But if you study the history, if you go and you get the background and you actually do the history of the logging site you're working on, then you're contributing to local history in your local historical society. Then you're doing science. And you can do that at the same time that you're doing metal detecting. It just takes a little more effort. And so that would be my thing. As far as legally, on private land, as long as you have permission from the landowner, archaeology, except for human remains, is treated as mineral rights. Essentially, if a private landowner lets you have access, you can do whatever you want as long as you do it with permission and agreement of the landowner. You cannot do that on public land. And that includes any navigable rivers or streams or anything like that. Can't do it on state parks, national forest of any kind. Then you're breaking federal and state law, and that does have criminal penalties.
So Ed Forrester is wondering, do you have any data on the numbers of Native Americans who worked in logging camps in the 1800s?
Again, this is where, this is the archaeology versus the written history, right? I mean, it was something that was there. You can pick it up in the photographs, you can pick it up in the archaeology, but it's never mentioned. The fact that I think there was kind of this idea of, there was a lot of racism in this time period, this idea of kind of, the white rich men who made their living, all the timber castles that you see, the big Victorian houses. They weren't going out of their way to give credit to the fact that they were employing a lot of tribal people to make them their money. But they certainly were. Yeah. So yeah, no one's really done a deep dive of that kind of level of history of actually looking at every individual name and doing the statistics and kind of the population breakdown. We're not that far deep into the history yet, but we probably will be in the next 2 or 3 generations.
So Don, you already answered this question in the chat, but maybe for the rest of everybody else, how do I sign up for the blacksmith topic?
We will send out a reminder or an invitation to participate in the next webinar about a week before the webinar to everyone who attended this webinar. Anyone who gets a message or an invitation that way, if you want to be dropped from the list, just put in unsubscribe and I will take you off the list. But otherwise, all past participants get a reminder that there's a webinar coming up and how to register.
So someone, Irvin Cox was talking about exploring back in the 70s and finding artifacts. And he was wondering particularly about the saws. And some of them seem to be in really good shape. Was it common that usable equipment was left when the camps were abandoned?
Yeah, I mean, you get what's called caching, where basically they would have been, covered in oil or grease or bacon fat, then wrapped in tarps and stashed for another year. And sometimes they're found that way by metal detectors. But a lot of times these were just tools that were kept around. If a saw is used, it can be used by a family for 50 or 75 years. You would keep it and then when the company folded, they would sell it, or the loggers would bring their own saws or take them home. My family's got several saws that are probably from the 1800s from on our farm. So a lot of these things just last forever. They don't build them like they used to.
So someone's wondering why they called it a dingle camp.
I'm not quite sure on the name. I'm not enough of an expert to know all the logging lingo. There's quite a bunch of lingo and phraseology and language that's particular to lumber camps. I think there's actually a book called Lumberjack Lingo that explains where a lot of those terms come from. I don't know that one, if that's an architectural reference or if it's something else like flapjack that just was picked up and developed.
So someone's wondering.
Dingle is a space between the 2 buildings. There you go. So a dingle is a thing.
So how likely is it that someone can find a written record of their grandfather's work in a logging camp circa 1900?
Needle in a haystack. I mean, some logging company archives are available at some of the university archives or the local historical society archives. Most of them were lost or burned or lost to fires.
So one place that I look on occasion is census records, and
Yeah,
there
that's a
were
good.
census takers that got into logging camps. And I found one in Presque Isle, Wisconsin, Weininger, and you had the Weininger car camp on your picture. And the census taker even recorded the person's job down to, cookie and blacksmith and teamster. They had the person's job recorded. And there again, you saw the ethnicity of the camps, all the different people and the names. It was really fascinating. Now, a lot of census takers didn't go into that kind of detail. I was really lucky to find that. So I just thought I'd share that little story.
I saw a good one there. One was our outhouse is my favorite place to dig. Well, yes, they're a wonderful place to dig. From an archaeology, the best stuff is there as far as the unwritten history is there. And after 150 years, you're not talking about what you think you're talking about. You're basically talking about night soil. But yeah, it takes a little bit of fortitude to realize what you're digging through.
So John Lovers is wondering where he can find more specific information about the CC camps in Wisconsin.
Jerry App's book, CCC Camps in Wisconsin, is a great starting place.
I also know that the museum at Pioneer Park in Rhinelander has a whole section on CC camps, and they've got a lot of the records there. It's really a great place to visit. So just people sharing stories about their family and the different camps and being cooks.
Yeah, cooks were a high, as most of you probably know, were a high value item. If a camp lived and died on the quality of its cook, and cook was often one of the most highest paid person in the logging camp, and they were recruited and tried to be stolen by different foremen and different company owners, and loggers would leave a camp if the cook was bad. The food was almost more important than the pay.
Yeah, and they also got a free meal, and depending on the quality of the meal, they might stay and work.
Yep.
So I know of a site in the Nicolet that may have been a timber cruiser camp, and could you describe what a timber cruiser shack would have looked like and the function?
I haven't dug one myself. Again, that you'd have to go to more of the experts on that, who I think you've had on previous talks. But you're basically talking about a tent camp or a small shanty kind of thing, where someone is basically working the kind of line by line, township by section by range across a part of a county. And what they're recording is the timber stands, but they're also laying out a lot of times they're laying out the survey grid. So they're doing old, the layup telescope kind of thing on a tripod with chains for surveying and things like that. But when they're doing that, they're also timber cruising the timber and seeing where the valuable stands are. So when they can pass information back to be bought by the logging company. So they're not just buying out, basically pre-logged out sections. But they're like any kind of field camp from that era. You're going to have a small kind of campground, kind of, fire camp. And if they don't leave much of an archaeological signature, you're going to have a few lost buttons here and there, and a little thing, maybe a little bit of a survey chain or two. But those camps might have then become a Dingle camp, which might become a town, which might become a mill. And so sometimes it's things that started out like a tent in the woods could become Wausau.
Yeah, a lot of them were very temporary, I think.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of this person's wondering about the kinds of excavations that you do at these lumber camps. Do you do extensive excavating when doing the archaeological work?
Not really. I mean, like I said, we're in a kind of a salvage mode. So our main thing is to identify What is it? Is it a logging camp? Can we confirm what we think it is? It is. So we might slice into a berm and see if we can pick up, yeah, we're seeing that. We'll hit what we call a midden, which is basically a trash dump, and get a sample of the artifacts. And that'll give us enough to get a good idea of what kind of date we're looking at. If we get lucky enough that we can see an outhouse or we can pick one up. Nowadays we have things like ground penetrating radar and remote sensing where we can basically push a lawnmower kind of thing over the ground and pick up holes and outhouses and berms that aren't obvious on the surface. But up in the Northwoods, you've got a lot of timber and a lot of congestion too. So no, I mean, when you're digging a logging camp, you're testing it usually, and maybe you're there for a handful of days. Now, if they're going to build something that's going to destroy what's considered a very important logging camp, you might do a full-on, months-long excavation, but they're fairly rare.
A question for Mary Jardis. Well done. I do know women and children in the Church of the Latter-day Saints were at camps cooking and caring for the clothes, etc. So that's a.
And I think that was true across the board. I think those people are an untold part of the story, and something that wasn't, what was actually happening on the ground was probably different than what the actual corporate headmasters knew about, which is the same as it is today. What do you tell your boss about how you got your job done? They're just interested in how it was done and how much of it did you get done. Looking forward to your talk, Mary.
So again, more acknowledgement of great presentation, but this will be an interesting question for you that we haven't covered before. Would this be a good career for a young person, an archaeologist?
It's a living, but your career is always going to be in ruins. No, I mean, it's one of those things you get into because it's a passion, and but it is very rare. You have to really work at it to get full-time employment in it. A lot of people do it for a few years and then decide that they want furniture and a mortgage and a little more settlement in their life. I bounced around everywhere from the Caribbean to Alaska in the course of my career, and worked for everybody from Native American tribes to the Army to the Corps of Engineers and everybody in between. So you have to piece it together just like a historian. If you're a writer or a historian, it's the same kind of career path. You've got to really hustle to make it work. But that being said, you're a paid treasure hunter.
Someone just mentioned another book, Caulked Boots and Cant Hooks. It's an excellent book, has a lot of interesting information about camp life. Yeah,
there's a lot of great history out there, and more's being written every year. And the great part about logging history is it's something that the academics have really not found yet. And so the history that's being done is usually being done at the local level and by people who are doing it just for the love of the history.
Lots and lots of compliments here about your maps, illustrations, photos. I particularly enjoyed the picture from Weininger, the car camp, because my family ran that mill.
Nice.
I like to see that. Just looking over the questions here.
There's one, Tom, that says, do you take on amateur archaeologists on your digs? You want to talk about what you do with digs and other people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't right now because I work at an Army base and things go boom there when we dig in the ground. But there are places like the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center or the Rhinelander Museum, as you mentioned, that do kind of volunteer projects, and volunteer digs do show up. The Forest Service has a great program called Passports in Time, the PIT program, which is basically where you can join a Forest Service archaeologist doing work in the forest, national forests. That'd be one I would recommend if you want to get into logging archaeology in the Nicolet. Passports in Time, the PIT program with the U.S. Forest Service.
Tim Milland again, just commenting about the number of farmers who went to work in the wintertime to earn some extra cash or token money, which is a whole nother topic.
And Paul Feeney asked about whether or not you use LiDAR for locating sites now that it is readily available.
I think right now that's really cutting edge. That's something you'll probably see in the next 5 to 10 years. Right now, we've been mainly focusing on using LiDAR to pick up on burial mounds, but certainly Logging camps would be a great choice for that. Right now, it's about, you've got to have someone who's interested in the archaeology and is well enough versed in the technology to make it happen. And then somebody who's really good at GIS, geographic information systems, to pull that data together for you. And, a lot of this is being done at a federal agency level, which maybe is not being, might not have the best technology at a given time, or it's being done at a contracted kind of for-profit level where you're not going to go out of your way to spend more money for the best and newest techniques. So
What's the most interesting artifact you found in a logging camp?
oh boy, that's a good one. I should have seen that one. At Fort McCoy, we dug a guy named Andy Sewell dug a site at the McCoy Mill, which formed the foundation of the McCoy family fortune. And it was the first sawmill in Monroe County. And he was digging the mill, the little town, mill town that it was associated with, got wiped out in a flood in the 1870s. And he found a barrel stencil, a brass barrel stencil that said McCoy's flour XXX super quality, 1871. And we all said that's the greatest artifact we've ever seen. It's got the name of the guy, what the site was, and the date the site was being used. And it looked like it had come out of the ground yesterday, and it was, 140 years old. And essentially it's at the Fort McCoy History Center right now. And it's the foundation of the McCoy that would later buy the land that would become Camp McCoy and Fort McCoy. So that would be my favorite.
Was there any form of state regulation of the logging companies? Did they enforce any of the rules? Were there?
I mean, this is something that's there's probably somebody who's much better an expert at this than I am, but legislation was not really there. It was a for-profit industry. What little control there was supposed to be, was very seldom exercised, and when it was, money talked and BS walked. So
there was a fair amount of timber theft cases,
yep.
But that was usually between the landowners, and I know that,
or the logging companies versus logging companies.
Correct. They just kept cutting when they didn't own the land, and there's lots of stories about that.
You have a lot of stories about that, about people cutting on Native American reservations or areas that were supposed to be Native owned. Native allotments, where basically, natives would come to their allotment and find it had been clear cutted 5 years ago by somebody. There are a lot of stories like that in Native America.
There was speculation about this, but somebody finally found the link and posted it in the chat for the Civilian Conservation Corps Record Center in St. Louis.
Yeah, the CCC legacy page. Yep, that's another good one.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tom.
Question about some new technology. Are archaeologists using LiDAR to do some of their investigations?
Yep, you bet. Like I said, right now we're mainly focused on burial mounds and protecting effigy mounds and burial mounds in Wisconsin with LiDAR. But you'll see them being used for other things. Right now, I'm trying to use them to track down homesteads at Fort McCoy. So it's one of those things. Basically, if you're not familiar with LiDAR, imagine a satellite coming along, shooting a radar beam and a picture of the Earth at the same time. And then you can remove the vegetation and basically get a 1 foot topo map of an area of land. And with that, you can pick up foundations and bumps and lumps in the ground and cut all the trees out of the picture digitally with the computer. And so what is invisible from a modern regular old aerial photo, now you can see essentially like it was every tree and every bush had been removed. And yeah, it's a powerful new tool in archaeology.
There are 2 more questions in the question and answer. First one says, are there any older logging camps that were nearby the river that may have been flooded out due to riverway modifications or erosions caused by all the clear cutting? I'm thinking there would be sites like this unless they were dredged up later.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, a lot of these sites were temporary, kind of things. Some of them were even built on the ice, and they'd be gone the next day. It's not uncommon to find remnants of some of these dams and piers underwater. I've lost several fishing lures to them over the years.
Okay, and then another one is, how does archaeological exploration of a lumber camp differ from exploration of an isolated mill town like Shannon Golden?
Boy, it's a matter of scale and complexity. I mean, if you're trying to, and what you're trying to understand, a lumber camp is one of probably a dozen that you might be working in the course of a project, whereas a town like that would be a major multi-year excavation project. And like I said, would probably only be done if like an interstate was being put through it or something like that. Or you had a research project from a university or a local historical society that was going to work there with a volunteer group for 10 or 20 years. But the issue with archaeology is, it's not just the digging. You've got to do 2 times that much in the laboratory and the write-up and the archival work and that stuff. So taking on something of that scale, you're talking about probably a half a career's commitment to do one dig like that.
Several people have mentioned the U.S. Forest Service site Passport in Time.
Yep. Great one. Yeah, I think, that's probably what I would recommend if people want to learn more about it. That's a great program and a great way to kind of get your hands on history in public lands. And those lands are there, they're public lands and they're there for you. So take advantage of those programs. Have you come across Native American burial sites as an accidental encounter doing your work? Quite a bit, not in logging camp stuff, but I will tell you a story where Native Americans helped us find Euro-American burials. There was a site near Rothschild, near Wausau, where a tavern, family died of smallpox in a tavern. And the whole family died, mom, dad, 2 or 3 kids, and they were buried somewhere on the property. And they were going to put a shopping mall where this burial was. And of course, we were concerned that this burial was going to be there. And it was right next to a Native American burial mound. So we're concerned about that as well. And I'm thinking, boy, where can this be? But it's a needle in a haystack again. Somewhere around this area, they buried 3 or 4 people, but they buried them in the 1860s. And I was talking to a tribal historian, a tribal historic preservation officer from the Menominee, and he said, look for the pine trees. And he said, look where the old growth pine is. And if you look in this timber stand where this site had been, there was a little cluster of old growth pine that had no earthly business being there. And what we found was that had been left by the loggers, probably the Native American loggers, as a marker of that as being a burial area. And they had left that basically to protect and preserve that site. So they didn't cut down timber, very valuable timber, because it was a burial ground sacred place, but it was a European burial ground sacred place. So there's a combination of Native American archaeology, Euro-American archaeology, and logging archaeology all combined into one. And we were able to save all of that, both the European graves and the Native American burial mounds on that site. So you kind of alluded to this, but someone mentioned the Bureau of Indian Affairs trying to make sure that the loggers didn't trespass on tribal lands. Yeah, I mean, just like you've got pipelines today that are trying to fight through, reservation lands, you had logging then. So, yep. How are we doing, Don? Did I miss? I mean, I was just combined some questions, but
there was one comment about Winnebago and some articles by Gladys Hill being a good source, Patty mentioned, and she was wondering if you'd ever read any of those articles.
I have not read everything about logging in Wisconsin. I'd have to say I've done a little bit, but I'm sure there's a lifetime worth of stuff I haven't read yet. So,
well, there were a lot of questions, lots of comments. The comments were all good. If we missed any of the questions, we apologize. But I think you've done a very good job fielding the questions that have been submitted. So with that, I think we will close. Any comments, Tom?
No, just a reminder on our next webinar. Join us. Okay. We'd be glad to have you. Like I said, it's free, but it only costs $20 to be a member of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. We'd be glad to have you.
If you want more talks like this, join.
For that matter, you could join the Archaeological Society too. Can't help us for some shameful promotion here. So Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it. It was a good time tonight and an excellent presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Good night.